Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you are on this fast forward planet, which is a turbulent place, has been for years, you could say for decades or generations. But certainly this last stretch, we have pandemics, we have invasions. An invasion of a country is not something that people thought was going to be it's not in the Steven Pinkerish vision of the world getting more peaceful, etc. And here we are, poised with saber rattling of all kinds. The climate is changing. Humans are surging into places with climate vulnerability. That mix is creating sort of an unstable social climate as well. And that's kind of what we're going to talk about today, this sort of interface between the actual climate and coastal issues and the human beings, 8 billion plus, heading toward 9 billion by around mid-century. And then lots of questions there from there forward with Ted Nordhaus, who I've gotten to know over the last 20 years since the early days of his work at the very beginning with Michael Schellenberger, The Death of Environmentalism. And now he has a new 4-part series out in the New Atlantis. There's a link there in bit.ly. I created a shortcut, bit.ly/Did Exxon Make It Rain? So that's a link to the essay, and you'll see that further down. Ted, it's really good to reconnect with you. I've been to some of the...
Great to finally do one of these with you, Andy. We've been talking about it for a long time. So
I had Patrick Brown on not long ago, your climate expert, one of them, and he was great. And I had a discussion with Vijaya Ramachandran about energy poverty with Johan Rockström. That was one of my favorites. It was Vijaya, Johan Rockström, two women from sub-Saharan Africa, all agreeing that the poor half of humanity needs more energy and that fossil fuels are unavoidably part of that. To have Rockström agree on that was pretty remarkable, considering he's lionized for thinking, I think, for people kind of really misportraying what he's thinking about. But today we're going to really talk about this, an issue I've centered many of these discussions on, and that I first wrote in the New York Times on an op-ed way back. Don't mix up vulnerability and exposure to climate hazards with climate change itself. And this happens so often that it's become almost impossible for the media to disentangle these things, at least to do so, and think they're going to get clicks. And as long as the media are measuring success through clicks and the like, I think we're in trouble. So Ted, again, it's great to be here with you. And I thought we'd just do a little bit of a reprise of your journey. And let me just see, I have a new way of showing these slides, so I'm going to make sure. So I can't believe it's almost 20 years since this. It was probably like a 1.5 Richter earthquake when it happened in the very beginning. But then it built into a substantial and sustained source of hopefully creative tension in the environmental community. Can you just give a quick snapshot of where we are now, 19 years, 20 years on? Any surprises about how that played out? And we will get to your new package. And
yeah, absolutely. So we're coming, this year marks the 20th anniversary of the publication. That the date there, 2005, is actually when the Times sort of did their big front page Sunday story about the death of environmentalism. But the essay was actually published about a month before the 2004 election. I think one of the reasons that it kind of went viral before very many things did, because there was like no social media. There were none of the things that make things go viral now. It was just kind of like some early blogs. And, that essay was published, at a time where I think a lot of folks on the left just, really sort of maybe not rationally just believed that there was no way that George W. Bush could be reelected for a second term. Some maybe shades of where we're going to end up this November. The essay kind of really sort of took the environmental movement to task for being sort of very insular, really sort of operating in this kind of self-reinforcing bubble of sort of funding and ideas and advocacy that we argued even then, 20 years ago, actually wasn't making a lot of progress to address this, problem that, increasingly people were saying was like the greatest environmental problem the world had ever faced. So, the argument was that there were sort of a set of ideas that had been carried over from the early days of the modern environmental movement in the 60s and 70s that sort of saw this as a pollution problem, that saw it as a sort of regulatory problem as opposed to a technology problem, that were really kind of getting in the way of sort of actually kind of making progress on reducing emissions. I think we've made a lot of progress in some ways. If you kind of go look at sort of IRA and where the climate discussion is today, I think the basic argument in the Death of Environmentalism really won the day, which is this is a technology problem. It's a generative challenge, not a regulatory challenge. You have to go build a whole new energy economy if you're going to get emissions to zero. Right. And that requires saying yes and not no.
Yeah, I think, when I started on the climate story in 1988, it just felt so much like a classic pollution problem that I think I was captured and carried along by that frame for a long time, and the media never really abandoned it. And the idea that sort of you just have to make clean energy cheaper, which is a big core part of what your thesis, I think, wasn't there yet. So these I hate the words frames. As a journalist, I never really thought about framing stories. I just wanted to say what was going on or not. But it really matters. And I think breaking that frame, or at least having people pause and reflect on the frame, was a really valuable thing to do. I do think it's played out, as you say. And we're going to talk about the IRA in a couple minutes too. So then, 2015-ish, this Eco-Modernist Manifesto, which kind of gathered a wider array of folks around the reality. You were building an organization, you were funding fellows. And this, again, gets us this sort of, I don't know, do you still think techno-optimism, is that a flawed way of thinking about it? Or is that really the heart of it?
Yeah, I mean, I think I think techno-optimism has come to mean very different things to different people. Last summer, my colleague Alex Trembath and I wrote a big piece kind of on the difference between what we call techno-optimism and technocratic optimism. And I think that sort of some of that early idea that, make clean energy cheap, kind of that there was a very important sort of public policy role and public role in kind of driving the sort of long-term improvement of these technologies. Still very much believe that, kind of transferred over to this idea that we could kind of do this all on a sort of a timetable and a schedule. Right. And so, we would set a target for, 2035, and then we would do, we back when we started, kind of industrial policy was kind of considered sort of a bygone idea that didn't work, and it's kind of come back into fashion now. And now there's the idea that you can not only kind of do industrial policy, but you can kind of do it on a timetable, which sort of starts to look like, a lot of the things that kind of got industrial policy in trouble in the first place, production targets and sort of things like that really didn't take into account the demand for these technologies, the market for them, or the just sort of the kind of, sort of whether they really kind of work in the ways that people need or want them to work. And I think there's, I think we're sort of already starting to see kind of some of the kind of dangers of some of the kind of overreach that happened as a result of that, even in the kind of 2 years since the IRA passed. We can get back to that later, but so I'm still a techno-optimist, but and this will kind of come to sort of some of the things that I say in this new essay, is just that, I don't think it's going to kind of happen on these kind of timeframes that anybody's talking about in terms of, net zero by 2035 or 2050 or whatever. It's a slow, difficult process. And I actually think that's okay because, I think I started out, I think there's a lot of people who are sort of like, the more I look at the science, the more kind of catastrophist I become. And I think I've kind of gone in the other direction. The more I kind of understand the underlying science, the way the climate actually works, the way it interfaces with human societies, I've gotten less catastrophic. I still think there's good reasons to take action on climate change, but I'm not kind of like, if we don't really, really deeply cut emissions by, in a decade or two, like really, really terrible things are going to happen to human societies. I don't think it actually works like that.
Yeah. And, in my 30 plus years reporting on this, I've come to the same conclusion that a lot of what's been interpreted as a climate emergency is a vulnerability emergency. I wrote a piece with that title a couple of years ago. Maybe it was 3 years ago. And you look at the hotspots of vulnerability, and they're all hotspots of opportunity as well, which is part of what's in your piece. So hopefully, we're going to get to that in a minute. Just a last step along the way, the Breakthrough Institute, and your work has focused on policy in some pretty productive ways around things like nuclear regulatory commission, stasis. And can you talk about that briefly? So, while you're talking about the role of technology and sort of lowering the barrier to change, on the scale we need in our energy systems, there are these other instrumental big regulatory blockages and things. So talk about that part, sort of the getting into the nuts and bolts of the policy.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, at least, kind of when you go back to Death of Environmentalism, we're basically saying, this is sort of a technology and infrastructure challenge and public investment challenge, not a regulatory challenge. And I think you get 20 years out, and I think I would kind of go beyond that and sort of say that, in a lot of regards, certainly in the US and a lot of other places, it's as much a deregulatory challenge as a regulatory challenge. That, if you're really about building a lot more nuclear, for that matter, a lot more renewables, you've just got to, we kind of have inherited this sort of massive sort of regulatory kind of bureaucracy and institutions and policies from the kind of early environmental movement, that were really kind of put in place to deal with the pollution problems of the kind of old energy economy, but are now huge obstacles to actually sort of building a cleaner energy economy and cleaner energy infrastructure. So whether that's NEPA or the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, and you can kind of go on. There's all the Jones Act, all sorts of things that kind of like might have made sense in 1970, but if you're really serious about kind of building a low carbon, clean energy economy as quickly as you can today, there are huge obstacles to doing so.
Absolutely. And I think you made a little progress with the NRC, would you say, or not?
Yeah. I think the thing that's really changed the whole conversation about nuclear at a high level, and now is changing it in terms of federal policy, is the fact that, historically, the nuclear debate, you had sort of the nuclear industry on one side of it, which sort of barely really was an industry. I mean, it was really a bunch of utilities and old industrial conglomerates, none of whose primary business was building nuclear reactors. The utilities, even in the heyday of building nuclear plants in this country, still overwhelmingly generated electricity with fossil fuels. And, whether it was General Electric or Westinghouse, mostly their businesses were not the nuclear reactor business. And on the other side of that, you had this quite potent anti-nuclear civil society environmental movement. And so the debate for like a generation was industry versus civil society. And I think the thing that changes the entire conversation about nuclear, and it obviously comes along with kind of growing concern about climate change is the development of, and the sort of entry in, and we were, about the first to do it, sort of civil society advocacy, independent of industry, for nuclear energy. And so I think that really over the kind of last decade is what puts nuclear back on the agenda, as a kind of serious, as an important environmental technology. And now, like literally over the last several years, we've been showing up at the NRC itself as civil society, independent of the industry advocates for nuclear energy. And it's had a huge impact. So, like when we started, there was an effort to modernize, Congress tells the NRC to go modernize, and the NRC really kind of, for a bunch of sort of cultural and bureaucratic and other reasons is sort of not really able to do so. And they they cut and paste all the old frameworks for regulating large light water reactors into this new framework for advanced small non-light water reactors. And, today the commission a couple of weeks ago just released its sort of revised, the staff sent its version, and the commission looked at it and sent it back to the staff and said, this needs major changes. And those major changes kind of follow pretty closely with almost exactly, everything that we've been saying for the last 2 years needed to happen. And that happened with a lot of pressure from Congress. And I think, frankly, just a lot of good sort of, technical work as well as sort of advocacy work to be like, if you want nuclear, and everyone now mostly agrees we need it, you just need really significant change at the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. And I think we got a long way to go, but I think we're finally starting to move in the right direction. So I'm pretty optimistic about that.
That's good. And it's good to see there's movement too. You've also, again, you've been focusing on the vulnerability, the aiming to clarify what's climate change and what's community change in terms of what we see out the window. You guys had your smoky West Coast moment, and then California, of course, has had a rainy period, and hopefully you're not getting into whiplash effect, which I've written about before, sort of weather whiplash, where places like California have flood one year, drought, mega drought is in the background, and drought the next year, and wildfires and no wildfires. How you carve coherent policy in a climate like that, I don't know. But so you've been sort of this force for that kind of logic. Because it's in the news, I got to bring up your initial colleague, who just can't seem to not be in the news, Michael Schellenberger, and he is really gained a lot of visibility in the last few years, starting with his what looked like a pro-nuclear push on the Midwest and the like, and then but he's gone in directions that really I find unnerving. I haven't spoken to him. I did a C-SPAN book panel with him when his last book came up. But can you just describe, for the folks like Tyler Norris who are eager to have some clarity on what your thinking is in the context of his thinking and where we go, where you are and where he is, that would be probably helpful.
Yeah, I mean, I think you've spoken to him more recently than I have. So, and it was a difficult and frankly not an amicable divorce. And even long before the kind of his current kind of reincarnation of himself as a sort of, I don't know, sort of MAGA-ish functionary. But, obviously I've been sort of as surprised by it and, frankly, a little shocked by it as anybody else. And, I think, as someone who's sort of as a leader of an institution, there's a lot of sort of, well, why isn't Breakthrough saying like, condemning his MAGA, blah, blah, blah. And I'm like, well, I have my personal opinions about it. I kind of like, I think, from the moment Trump was elected, kind of wrote about my concerns about, where this was going in terms of sort of American democracy. And at an institutional level, it's kind of like, I am, from early on, I sort of pushed back against some of his kind of nuclear supremacy kind of stuff. As part of why, we split up was because I was like, I did not want to be a sort of nuclear only, kind of you're with us or you're against us,
Right.
kind of operation. It's never what we were. It's not what we are now. And, on the energy stuff, I mean, I think Tyler and, sort of some other folks have got this idea that, if you go back to the Eco-Modernist Manifesto, we kind of identified a set of issues, I think fairly early on, that were going to be problems for a very renewable heavy energy transition. The land use consequences of it. And, you can argue about whether it's that big a deal or not in some sort of abstracted way, but, you're going to build a lot of infrastructure in a lot of places that people aren't accustomed to having energy infrastructure.
Right.
They're not all going to want it. They're not all going to like it. And there's sort of similar issues around kind of critical minerals and dealing with the unavoidable sort of intermittency of these technologies. And it's like, well, we can fix that with like this huge transmission network, but that makes the land use challenges even greater.
Yeah.
I think we're seeing a bunch of those chickens come home to roost now. And there's a certain sort of kind of nuclear advocate who's like, well, that's your fault because you said this was going to be a problem and was going to happen. And it's like, well, no. I think there's a difference between pointing those issues out and becoming sort of a fully anti-renewables advocate, which we are not. We're in fact working right now to try to go kind of get NEPA and a bunch of other policy fixed so that it's easier to build some of this stuff. And that is, I define this stuff broadly, but stuff like wind and solar and transmission are absolutely part of that package.
Right.
So, I guess, I've been in this business long enough to know that, the first thing that you do, when you have these sorts of problems is go shoot the messenger. And I think there's been a lot of people for a long time who've been, trying to do that and sort of blaming us. And because we've sort of said that, you had the thing about electric vehicles, apparently we're also to blame for the fact that Americans aren't kind of running as fast as they can to buy electric vehicles. And it's like, well, no, I mean, this was, you can see a set of the challenges with this, and there's reason to think that it'll get better. And I hope we'll build more renewable energy. I'm also don't think that we're going to do as much of it as a lot of renewables advocates like Tyler think. So,
yeah. And by the way, anyone in my part of Maine, we have summer Teslas, like the Teslas show up in the summer, but they're not here in the winter. There are maybe a couple that I've seen in the winter, but so it's really hard, for big.
I hear they got great traction. Good for kind of four-wheel
not on
drive.
our road.
All right.
I think even Elon's tank, that truck, would have trouble on some of the roads up here. But so this is helpful. I think we could do more on this question. I also think a problem with Michael is he, among many, he sort of intensifies the binary quality of things. Yes, no. Here he's saying the anti-human movement. The idea that there isn't a gradient in the environmental and or libertarian communities is fantasy. There's a huge gradient, and there's a lot of overlap. There are libertarians who love to be off the grid, and so it's like he's just kind of taken this to the max in a way that I think is part of the problem with our country that goes way beyond the basket of sustainability questions, obviously.
Yeah, look, Michael Schellenberger is is a symptom, not the cause. And frankly, there are a lot of people on all sides of the political spectrum doing this. Frankly, it pays literally and figuratively. It's how you
Yeah,
get
right.
clicks, it's how you get attention, it's how you build an audience. And I think Michael, early on after he leaves Breakthrough, sort of kind of flails around a bit. He runs for governor as a Democrat, then he runs for governor of California as an independent. And I think increasingly over the time where he really kind of finds his voice and his audience is on the right. And, as a sort of fairly narcissistic personality, Michael followed his audience, and this is where it led him.
Yes.
And,
So that's,
he's not alone in doing that on all sides of the political spectrum.
no, I know. Unfortunately, there was a time when I knew and camped with Bobby Kennedy Jr.
Yeah.
And the Bobby Kennedy Jr. that we went camping with on an island in the Hudson River is not the Bobby Kennedy Jr. I know today. So let's move on to the subject.
Yeah, I mean, the thing that Michael most wants us to be doing is talking about him, so we should
exactly.
Stop.
So onward. So what prompted this essay? Other Patrick Brown and others there, have dug in on this. I've certainly spent years trying to get people to think about vulnerability reduction as a core component of, and it's not even climate adaptation, it's vulnerability reduction, because it's to today's variable climate as well as tomorrow's changing climate. So what prompted you to get into this, and then we'll get to some.
Well, it's kind of funny, Ari, who's the executive editor, has reached out to me last summer. I think it was it was after the Lahaina fire. And, Ari sort of starts looking at it and kind of goes like, this doesn't really look like climate change. I mean, you can kind of find some sort of very minor, depending on who you ask, climate signal there. But, it wasn't actually, a kind of climate change driven drought. Water shortages were largely driven by kind of political battles in the area. There was a terribly bungled on multiple levels emergency response that closed the roads that people needed to use to evacuate. And so Ari sort of says, well, would you write something about this and about the ways and his sort of framing of this was, well, there's just a lot of uncertainty about the degree to which climate change is affecting this. And, I was kind of like, well, there's a lot of uncertainty about various things about climate change, but actually there's a reasonable amount of certainty about, how climate change is actually acting on things like this and how it's not.
Right.
And so I kind of think I wrote an initial kind of draft for him that, might have been like 3,000 words, and they kept asking questions and kept asking questions and kept asking questions. And by the time we were done, it was 9,000 words, and we broke it up into 4 parts. Probably 6 weeks of fact checking on this thing. So, I think, the thing that I wanted to pull together was one, I think there's this sort of broad misunderstanding of the way in which kind of climate change affects weather and climate extremes. And so there's, and I in the essay, and there's a picture of it there, kind of like the mental model is literally the poster from An Inconvenient Truth, where it's literally like a hurricane coming out of a smokestack. And that's just not how it works. There are going to be quite extreme hurricanes. There were before climate change. There would be without any climate change. And the main driver of almost all weather and climate extremes today and into the future is natural variability. It's not climate change. The impact that climate change is having is on the margins. It's making various phenomena marginally more intense. That is not the sense that you get if you read, mainstream kind of media descriptions of that. And you can kind of read it really carefully and see that reporters and others are often kind of hedging and it's technically correct. But, I think for the average reader, what they get from it is that literally these hurricanes and heat waves and other events are literally happening because of climate change. And that's just not true. So, and then you kind of take that and go to, well, the natural disasters and rising economic costs associated with extreme events and, kind of climate mortality and what's happening there. And again, there's just very little connection today between climate change and extreme event costs. And, meanwhile, mortality is moving in the other direction. It's fallen precipitously. And again, I think that if you ask the average reader of something like the New York Times, they would, not tell you that, or would not know that. And the Times has sort of massively, since you were there, Andy, I'm sure massively increased its climate coverage. And the result of that, I think, if you went and just did a sort of study of, understandings of New York Times of climate change among dedicated New York Times readers, I think you would find a lot of misperceptions about, both the actual kind of physical science and the disaster science.
So then I did a discussion here with Roger Pilkey Jr. A month or two ago, whenever January, and I've been. Well, I'll just show you what I called him "he who must not be named," because the media literally don't call him. He's been kind of banished, to use another expression from a movie, and this is this sort of narrative capture that I think you and I have tweeted about together, where one of the phenomena that happens in the media is you end up with this sense of good and bad guys within the science community, as opposed to what the data are actually saying. And does that feel like it's part of what you're seeing too?
Yeah.
Well, and actually, Patrick Brown, right there at the Breakthrough Institute, was another.
Yeah. I mean, it gets. I think that a bunch of us have been sort of functionally, and I hate the word, and it just kind of gets into this crazy discourse we're having about lots of things, but. I do think it's the case that a bunch of us have, to varying degrees, been sort of canceled in the mainstream media for actually being here's what the actual science says. Here's what the the result of that, and I have to struggle with this a bunch myself, is if I want to kind of get increase the salience of, say, nuclear regulatory reform, or kind of issues around sort of accurate representations of climate science, often I can go and get that, put that in the Wall Street Journal anytime I want. It's very difficult for me to get that in the New York Times. Right. And so the result is that it gets very difficult to sort of disrupt the polarization, because the sort of, I think, in a lot of the mainstream outlets, the kind of desire to not give a platform to anyone kind of pushing back against the narrative just sort of reifies all of this as sort of culture war object. I don't know what to do about it except to talk about it, right? And there's, I think it's not accidental that some of this has happened. From back time at the Times, there was the whole false balance thing, and there was sort of just huge pressure early on to sort of de-platform, kind of anyone suggesting, climate denial, which, once upon a time meant people who were literally there's no such thing as climate change. And now it kind of James Hansen has been attacked as a climate denier, for saying that we need nuclear energy. So this sort of, this idea of climate denial has sort of metastasized to kind of encompass, at least implicitly, anyone who kind of challenges the sort of dominant green narrative about climate change and the solutions to it. Not surprisingly, then we see a kind of profoundly polarized, not only media environment, but political environment around it. And, I think that, there's been this idea that by making this sort of a litmus test issue in the Democratic Party, that's how you make progress. But I think the challenge is that, of course, it's if there's, Trump reelected, particularly if a Republican sees control of Congress, all that stuff that Biden done is just going to get dismantled pretty quickly.
Yeah.
And this does not look to me like a recipe for a sustainability agenda. It's going to bring its own kind of whiplash, as you call it.
Yeah, your piece, your essay also has a section where, well, you refer to the early days with Al Gore and Inconvenient Truth, but you also have a section there on how there's sort of a drift that happens where the calamitous conclusion, someone who's a high-profile person like Al Gore will make that point, or the media, and then they'll sort of de-drift down to saying, well, now it's actually looking like it's not going to be so bad. I think that's part of what I saw in one section of your essay.
Yeah, there's been a kind of, I think what happens is it's like, supposedly we were headed to 5 degrees. Now we're headed, everyone's kind of like 3 degrees, maybe less than that. And the reaction to that was not like, okay, maybe we need to kind of recalibrate this catastrophic narrative. We just shifted we shifted the locus of catastrophe from 5 degrees to 3 degrees. Because and again, there will be climate impacts at 3 degrees, but we're headed somewhere between 2 and 3 degrees, I think, by the end of this century. There are going to be climate, and, insofar as policy really matters, it matters, on that kind of margin. Like, are you going to end up closer to 2 or closer to 3? There will be climate impacts there. I think human societies actually will adapt to those impacts pretty well. I think the bigger issue for me is sort of the rest of nature, which doesn't have the same, kind of adaptive capacity. So that's what
I'm going to show you something that I think illustrates another part of the paradox. And, Michael Mann, the scientist, is one of the most pugnacious and determined and successful climate communicating scientists out there. And his book, he wrote a couple of pretty hot books about climate, the Hockey Stick and the Climate Wars, and another one with the New Climate War was all about the politics. And his new book, which just came out this past year, I haven't had him on yet. I've been planning to, but I tweeted a whole Twitter thread about X thread, whatever, about how interestingly non-calamitous his book is. But no one, you see, here's his book, and here's this line about the West Antarctic ice sheet. The Thwaites, the Doomsday Glacier, as my friend Jeff Goodell, at Rolling Stone dubbed it back in 2017. And here in this book, Michael Mann says there's plenty of blame to go around. Calling the Thwaites Glacier the Doomsday Glacier doesn't help, nor do breathless institutional press releases that overstate the significance of every science or nature article on the topic, and insisting that their institution's latest research portends a revolutionary change in our thinking. And he also has a section on the Atlantic meridional overturning, which he helped name like a decade ago, and he says doesn't exist now. And he thinks the whole running amok with the AMOC shutdown is similarly overheated. But no one quotes him on this. And this book, I haven't checked sales, but I don't think it's doing nearly as much as the more, the books that politicize or take a political frame. And if you look at his Twitter thread, it's all about politics right now. And that's fine. He's a human being. He's a voter, But so what do you think about that? Is this sort of
I think you better be careful, or he's going to, lose his it always struck me as very interesting that kind of like the sort of shift from like James Hansen to Michael Mann as kind of like the go-to scientist in terms of in the climate discourse really kind of follows like Hansen's shift, kind of coming out first against the cap and trade bill, the Waxman-Markey bill, and then for nuclear energy. And at that moment, he's unreliable, and everyone, Michael Mann, who's this much more kind of environmental climate scientist. So, no doubt there is a legion of ambitious young kind of catastrophic scientists eager to kind of fill this role should man kind of continue down this line. But I do think there's sort of some sort of chickens coming home to roost here, which is that I think a lot of folks, a lot of high-profile celebrity climate scientists, kind of sort of build an audience and are very successful professionally, kind of making sort of quite catastrophic claims and demands for sort of immediate action and that kind of thing. And kind of people took them both literally and seriously. And now there's this sort of, oh my God, the doomism, and what do we do about this doomism? And it's like, well, you created it. This is your own creation here. And even now, like a lot of the complaint about the doomism is not that it's sort of overheated in terms of a lot of the kind of claims, even if it's like, well, extinction isn't the problem, but it will all be very, very terrible. The catastrophism is always being reified in the discourse. But the complaint is just that it's leading people to give up. It's not too late to sort of, stabilize at 1.5 or whatever it is. And you can't give up. And it's kind of like, I don't know. I mean, if you take all of this literally and seriously, kind of doomism is not an unreasonable reaction. When you look at kind of, what progress the world is making on decarbonization and what the sort of much of the mainstream kind of what the climate movement and a lot of climate scientists are telling us about the consequences of climate change. Like why wouldn't you be like the world is going to end?
Right. So let's get back to your essay again, which is in the New Atlantis, and there's a shortcut there for people to click to it. And of course, this broadcast will be archived right away when we're done. You can go back and look at things and links and stuff. So you basically set up the first two chapters were about, you start with Galveston, Texas, and hurricanes history, and you go through the data from the whole disaster research community, showing both the great success of declining overall losses, both of human loss, and taking away this picture of the $1 billion disasters accelerating so fast, because if you account for the built vulnerability and exposure, that kind of goes away. And then you get to the selling of this, which we were talking about a little bit a minute ago, but maybe a little bit more on one of the manifestations of trying to drive policy recently has been the World Weather Attribution exercise, which is a big chunk of chapter 3, I think, part 3 of your essay. So what do you think about that whole process? A lot of that, if you look back at the funding, it's coming because of the possibility of this being utilized in litigation against Exxon and the like. So it's a tool.
Yeah, this methodology, the whole thing was kind of created, both to kind of provide a basis for litigation, and also just more generally to kind of drive sort of public perception of sort of the climate going crazy. And the way you do that is coming up with sort of new attribution methods, because the old ones don't actually kind of provide the evidence that the movement needed, or felt it needed. And secondly, you need a villain. So it's the fossil fuel. It's these evil, it's not us, it's them. It's these bad people. All of this climate change and this fossil fuel dependence is just a grand conspiracy by these sort of greedy, profit-minded corporations that want to keep us hooked on fossil fuels. It's kind of like, really, never mind that fossil fuels have, really enormous, kind of utility to modern life. We're very dependent on them because actually they kind of do pretty amazing things for us. And we should try to find ways to do all those amazing things without the fossil fuels. but that's easier said than done, and it's going to take a long time, and it's going to require a lot of technology. But all of that gets kind of buried in this sort of discourse, which is that like literally like every hurricane or rainstorm is because Exxon, kind of denied climate science in the 80s and 90s. It's like, you can talk about what Exxon did and didn't do. And I think mostly the sort of climate science part of it is overrated. Like a lot of the scientists, Hansen, Marty Hoffert, others who like really were kind of the original sort of climate scientists who kind of do a lot of the work to say this thing is real, it's happening. Many of them worked for Exxon.
Marty for sure.
And much of this research was funded by Exxon. It was made public available. It wasn't like it was secret research that nobody knew about. And if you kind of look at what Exxon mostly did, it was not denying climate science. It was just sort of talking about the economic costs of moving rapidly away from fossil fuels, which, you can argue about the cost of renewables today, but certainly in the 1990s where, and even the 2000s when a lot of this is happening, renewable energy is vastly more expensive. The idea that sort of somehow if Exxon doesn't do this, we're going to go like get rid of the fossil fuels and stabilize it under 2 degrees. And it's just crazy. The technologies just weren't there. So this, the irony in this is, of course, is that like there really is. I don't want to say conspiracy in this weird like conspiracy theory way, but there is an active, quite intentional effort to go kind of, frankly, misrepresent a lot of current day weather extremes as happening because of climate change. And it's literally like they don't even try to hide it. They go have this meeting in 2011, run by the Union of Concerned Scientists, and they go publish the proceedings. You can go read the whole thing online, and they're literally like, well, it's really hard to find a signal in the disasters or even a lot of the kind of trends in terms of weather. So we need to come up with a new method to show that climate change is causing extreme weather. And that really, literally is the origin of world weather attribution. And what they do is kind of this sort of statistical sleight of hand, which is they say, okay, we're not going to know whether we can sort of find evidence of sort of long-term intensification of various extreme weather trends, The question we're going to ask is, how much more likely was this extreme event, this hurricane or this flood or whatever, to have happened with climate change than without climate change? And then you get these, 40% or, once in every 200 years versus once in every 50 years or whatever it is. Right. And people go, well, that's like making the everybody reads this. And, if you kind of go and you kind of go down and you read through all the appendices, it's not actually what their analysis says. Actually showing is that climate change makes an event, how likely is it that an event that is somewhat more extreme than the event that would have happened without climate change is happening? And it's almost like a tautological statistical analysis. Right. But people read that to be like there would be no extreme event without climate change, which is just simply not the case. And when you just go represent it as how much did climate change contribute to this event? How much more rainfall is there? It's like, in a very 50-year, 10-inch extreme rainfall event without climate change is an 11-inch extreme rainfall event with climate change. Right. Climate change is making it somewhat more extreme, but the 10-year, the 10 inches of rainfall in a day or two is still an incredibly extreme event that's going to have a lot of consequences. And that's just natural climate variability. That is not climate change. So when you read these things, and it's just like almost like the go-to thing for any media coverage of extreme events now, these world weather attributions are cited, and they're cited as if climate change made the event happen. And that's just simply not, that's not what world weather attribution is doing. And they're quite explicit that the intention here is political. That's why they created it. Freddie Otto, again, she doesn't even hide it. She's really clear about why she.
But she's also, I've interviewed Martin van Alst, who's part of the group. He's also a high-level IPCC scientist who comes at it from the demographic side. He works with the International Red Cross, and he says, every report has the attribution to human factors on the ground also, that it's in the report, meaning the vulnerability and exposure, but the media ignore it. He says, right. He said on this show, I could play the clip if I could find it, that, when we did Madagascar, all they wanted was the climate stuff. And here, Freddie, through the Grantham folks who had a big part of this, but she says the climate crisis is a massive problem, but when politicians fault it entirely for every disaster, attention is deflected from local measures that might build resiliency. That needs to change. So sometimes they're saying this, but all of the time it's ignored. It's kind of like Michael Mann saying there's no doomsday glacier.
I kind of feel like they know.
Is it all my fault? Is it all the media's fault?
No, I mean, I kind of feel like they know it's going to be ignored.
Yeah, maybe. Well, we could,
and, if you go read, it's in there. But if you go even look at how the world weather attribution reports are framed, I'll just give you another example. I couldn't believe this. Patrick actually pointed this out to me. They come out with their big thing on the Libya, the Mediterranean extreme rain event that resulted in the dam collapse. And it's very, very clear. And I think they probably said it somewhere in the report that, the dams collapsed because everyone knew from the moment they were built that they'd been under-engineered, and then they weren't maintained. They go and they kind of do the analysis of what's the impact, and you get this, it had as much as 50%, intensification. Well, they went and they found there were actually when they looked at the different sort of models that looked at how much climate change would contribute to events like this in that region. I think there were sort of 14 different sort of ensemble of 14 or 13 different models. Well, 6 of them actually concluded that climate change would reduce extreme rainfall events in that region.
Right.
So the first thing they do is they say, well, we know that climate change is going to make these things worse. So we're going to throw out the 6 ones that actually show a reduction in the incidence and intensity of extreme rainfall events in the region. And then the 7 kind of go from 0, and most of them are very modest increases. And there's just literally one that's over 40% intensification. And they say, that's sort of the outer whatever thing. And they go and they then write the thing in such a way that it really centers this actual single outlier model that shows a very significant increase in events like this. And of course, that is the headline that literally every media outlet picks up. And I frankly have a hard time believing that they didn't know exactly how this was going to work when they wrote the report, just to be kind of blunt about it. And that's all considered okay, because even if it results in misleading, it's sort of, there's this harm reduction view that I talk about in the piece where it's well, it's okay because it'll help people get more concerned about the problem and take more action. And so even if it's not technically correct or it's misrepresented in the media, it's okay because as long as it's misrepresented in the right direction.
Well, that's Mike Hume I had on the show talking about climatism, and he has a whole chapter in his book on the idea of the noble lie, that goes back to the Greek thinkers. The noble lie is the untruth that's presented, knowing it's not quite right, but for good reasons. And I think that kicks back in so many ways. Ultimately, it fuels, among other things, it fuels those on the naysaying side who want nothing to happen to the overstatement, and then it ends up just being argued from the edges, and people tune out. I've called this the whiplash effect. Since 2008, I wrote about that in 2008. That beware overstatement. It's not your friend. You may think it's your friend on a particular year, but then as soon as and this is the same with health, of course. Coffee causes cancer. No, it's good for you, et cetera, et cetera. And so people fuzz out and say, screw this. And I just worry deeply that the media are I think, partially complicit, consciously, as you say, driving a narrative that they can't figure out how to let go of. But you have a section here, part 4 is about the costs of all this. And, you have an economics background, and I came late to the idea of opportunity cost. It's not something I grew up. I think I took one economics class in college. So what are the costs?
For the record, I actually don't have an economics background.
Okay.
My uncle is obviously
your uncle.
And I kind of pay attention to, have increasingly paid attention, but I certainly have no training in economics.
So, so what are the costs of catastrophism?
I think there's multiple things. The first is the main effect, if you kind of go back all the way to the beginning, the increasingly catastrophic climate narrative has had basically zero impact on public opinion in terms of levels of public concern about the problem. The one thing that it has done, it has polarized the debate. So the one overwhelming change in public opinion over 30 years you can see is it's gotten more and more polarized. So for every Democrat who now cares more about climate change, there's a Republican who cares less and doesn't, is less inclined to believe it's happening. The second thing obviously is fatalism. We've known from the beginning, and I quote this fabulous study that was done by this shop called the Frameworks Institute in 2000. I think NRDC and some of the other green groups hired them to help us figure out how to make, how to talk about extreme weather that'll make people care more about climate change. So they go and they do all these focus groups. And what they find in the focus groups is that, the reaction to all the catastrophe is not we need the government to go and, ban fossil fuels. The reaction is, I need to buy an SUV because the weather's going to get worse.
Right.
So there's an adaptive response. It's not a mitigation response. Right. And you get increasing amounts of sort of fatalism and these sort of adaptive reactions to this stuff. Obviously we've got this sort of now this huge, big kind of sort of bloom of kind of climate anxiety, especially among the young.
Right.
And, it also just drives really ill-conceived policy that creates backlash itself. So it's kind of it should not surprise us that, kind of this catastrophic view of climate has resulted in, various proposals to ban ICE, internal combustion engines, and gas stoves and various other things, and that, and meat or whatever. And you can talk about whether who wanted to really ban these things or not. But at a discursive level, it's very kind of clear, I think, to a lot of people where a lot of the environmental community wants to go. And unsurprisingly, a lot of people are no, thank you.
Right.
You're not going to tell me I can't have a gas stove or that I can't, drive a Ford Bronco, or that, I can't eat a hamburger.
And this, by the way, this gets back to your Death of Environmentalism theme, which way back when was pointing out that nearly all of the environmental rhetoric that we grew up with was the rhetoric of no.
Yeah,
it was taking things away.
Right. It's sort of it's amazing because it's taken things that are actually really cool technologies, I mean, I think we got a ways to go before we really see kind of mass adoptions of EVs in the United States, which is a particularly challenging market.
Right.
But like, these EVs are really kind of quite amazing technologies, and they have like real advantages over, the fossil fuel power technologies. And the same like an induction stove or a heat pump. I mean, they're really cool, and people should be like excited about these things. And the minute that you're like, let me tell you why you should be excited about it, because like it's the future, and we're not going to let you buy anything else in 10 years. You turn this thing from like something that's aspirational, that people are like, wow, technology, it's getting better, and someday I'm going to own that, and I'm going to like it, and it's going to be great, to like, these sort of green weenies are no pun intended to any of my green weenie friends, of whom I have many, are going to make me, are going to take away my pickup truck.
Right. Do you have time to go a few more minutes, by the way?
Sorry, what?
Do you have time to go a few more minutes?
Yeah, I can go over for sure.
That's great. Let's get back to current events in the IRA. You have written about it recently, and something that I've made this point on this slide a lot, especially since I dug in deeply on the behavioral science and social science, and the fact that there's this guy who CNN interviewed in 2015 in the most skeptical county in America on global warming, in the oil patch in Oklahoma, and he's getting off the grid. His house is half covered with solar panels, and it's for the same reasons he would never vote for Hillary Clinton back in 2016. It's because he wants to make his own energy, not be beholden to a company or a government. But when I talk to people, without the climate change foregrounded, you can have a list of basic steps, including policy, including incentives, and including some regulations that people seem to be all lined up on. But how do we take the conversation there? You've been trying for 20 years. We're more polarized than ever. I could easily say that everything I've tried to do through .earth and what I do now and what you do is a total failure. So what can we get to this point of having a discharged conversation around what communities actually want?
Right. Yeah, I mean, I think that there's sort of a lot of folks, I think, for a long time, but I think increasingly, like, we have to figure out how to push back against this crazy, because it's just, and, it's not just on climate, it's kind of crazy everywhere. And so the question is kind of, how do you kind of sort of reconstitute a center that can hold? And in some ways, it's just kind of it is the sort of central question of our time. And again, on a whole lot of things well beyond climate change.
Yeah.
And I think the climate problem is kind of exacerbated by the fact that, it's just the amount, from when I started and when you were still covering stuff at the times, the amount of money that has come into the climate space, I can't believe how much. I think University of Indiana, the Lilly School of Philanthropy there just put a study out this fall that U.S. climate philanthropy is now $8 billion a year.
Wow.
You have to come and think about that. There's this idea that the green climate movement are these sort of plucky underdogs, grassroots, let's go fight the man and whatever. And it's literally, it's the wealthiest social movement in human history.
Wow.
It's an incredible amount I can't figure out how we're spending $9 billion a year. It's shocking. And it's kind of underwritten, you can talk about Koch brothers or whatever, but it's pretty clear where most of the billionaire money is going. And it's not, it's certainly not to the Breakthrough Institute. and I write about the fact that a bunch of that money is actually going to the media outlets. Like
It
all
is,
of
yeah.
this explosion of climate coverage is being underwritten by environmental philanthropy. And it's really, really clear that the expectation here is not that you're going to publish a lot of stuff that kind of challenges the narrative. It's a hard problem, and the best I can figure out is you kind of do the right thing. I do the best I can to sort of try to kind of stay out of the culture war stuff, while at the same time trying to kind of do the work in a way that it's salient enough that anyone needs to deal with it. Because if you're just kind of I'm not going to do culture war, I'm not going to do anything that's controversial, I'm just going to be whatever, it's a recipe for just being ignored. It's a hard, like everything else in climate, it's a hard problem, not an easy one. And I think that the only thing we have going for us is that the climate agenda, as it's been defined by the climate movement, it's an impossible agenda. Despite the enormous resources that the movement has, it's an extremely brittle and fragile politics, which is why it takes the thing that's amazing, if you go back at all this supposed Exxon kind of conspiracy to, the amount of money that they ever sent to kind of these climate denial shops in the 90s and early 2000s. I mean, it might have been $10 million total. I mean, it's a tiny amount of money in the context of the amount of sort of philanthropic and other money that was going into the space. But it really took very, very little to disrupt the environmental agenda, because it's sort of built on sand, both in terms of a lot of the actual claims around things like climate impacts, but also the idea that you're going to decarbonize the US or the global economy at the rates that anyone's talking about. It's just literally not going to happen. So the advantage that we have when we start showing up at a place like the NRC is A, no one else is doing it. And B, it really didn't take that much for some advocates to start showing up and being like, no, nuclear is a really good, safe technology. It's good for the environment. We need to go fix the regulatory system. So I think there's a whole lot of opportunity there where, even though if you looked at the mainstream sort of discourse, you'd be like, we're losing. If you kind of look at, even the kind of IRA and the sort of shift in the kind of whole approach has really changed.
For sure. And that's what I wanted to get at briefly before we end with one little coda as well. So back in 2014, Kostas Samaras from Carnegie Mellon, the IPCC report that had come out at the time basically was making this point: we can do this with what we know, that we don't need more research and basic technologies for climate. But he had this line, he says, there's a cliche among policy wonks, which happens to be true: the budget is policy. And when the infrastructure bill came to pass, and then the IRA, it felt to me like this was a manifestation of this, a good one. I think, in the end, it shows you that you can shift the not just narratives, but possibilities with money offered in different ways. And I don't know what your overall, if you have like 5 more minutes, I could show a 1-minute clip from Jigar Shah that I think totally illustrates the opportunity that's been created to create a sort of, I won't call it post-partisan, but less partisan landscape.
Right.
And it's just like 1 minute. Let me see if it will work here with the want to make sure the sound is on. Are you hearing the sound?
Actually, tens of thousands of people.
Do you hear it?
Who are already active on these issues. When you think about what this takes, we have 19,500 organized cities and towns and communities in this country. That's it. 19,500. 14,500 of them have a population that's less than 5,000, right? And so what this requires is sustained effort at the local level, always, right? When the transit authority makes the decision to replace old diesel buses with something else, they need to choose electric buses. And we have programs to pay for it. But if the transit agency doesn't apply for the program, it doesn't happen. And I can't force them to do it from the federal government. All I can do is say, here are all of the resources. But someone in local community can force them to make a decision that's in their own best financial interest. The same thing's true with the way in which school buses are done. Only 50% of streetlights in this country are LED. We could replace all the rest of the streetlights with LED lights.
So he goes on to say essentially that things have gotten flipped.
We have thousands, actually tens of
that things are flipped now. That you remember the struggles over the climate bill of 2008, 2009, 2010, which was a no bill, of course, restrictive, with some fantastical carbon offsets and things. And here's a pot of money and I don't think the environmental community has grasped how to make this point. I don't think they're even set up to do it. The Sierra Club, I was on a conversation with them and they did get it. That what we need now is activism to get the resources, not activism to stop something or at the federal level. And it doesn't take a lot. He goes on to say, all we need is, one or two change makers in every town in America for a couple hours a week, going to town meetings and stuff. I think that's part of the solution path here. I don't know if that feels, and people say, well, it's too bespoke, it's too distributed, but it's not.
I think we need people showing up to build stuff. And so like the Sierra Club's like, hey, we got all the money for the buses, but the local chapter of the Sierra Club also often has various objections to, a bunch of the actual infrastructure development.
Absolutely.
And then the other thing is just like, and this is a critical point, that I made earlier. It's like, you can go put all that money on the table. But because you've gone and pulled, the way you've done that, through a very partisan reconciliation bill and through a much, longer term strategy, quite explicit strategy, on the left and in the climate movement to polarize the issue, is that like, unsurprisingly, then what you're seeing at the local level in a lot of the places is like actually these kind of places being like, no solar farm, no wind, we're going to pass a moratorium, we're going to block this. And again, it's because, I wrote a piece years ago on what I call quiet climate policy. And it really argued for de-escalating, trying to kind of take this out of the kind of national political partisan kind of calculations on both sides, and turning the rhetoric down in order to sort of reduce the political contestation where this is kind of being kind of part of the sort of value proposition on either side of the issue of the two parties politically. Because once it becomes that, and especially with like, there's been a nationalization of politics in a way that, wasn't the case, 20 or 30 years ago, where like, these local decisions and local elections and things like that are increasingly seen through the sort of partisan, polarized lens of national politics. And so I think that dynamic, and again, it goes right back to sort of the way that the kind of catastrophic climate narrative has been constructed, really undermines all the things that Jigger's talking about there.
Yeah. Okay. Well, that's worth some more consideration and probably another webcast or two. The last thing I'm going to close out with is getting back to Jesse Osabel, who started informing my journalism in the 90s, and he's still out there. And it sounds like he'll be at your
summer. He's coming back to the dialogue, I think 10 years after he last came, and told us that atmospheric concentrations of CO2 would never exceed 550 ppm. And we all thought he was crazy. And yet sort of here we are.
Yeah. So, and he wrote a piece in 1999. The title of this piece in IEEE's magazine was "Because the Human Brain Does Not Change, Technology Must." Now, the human brain is probably changing in ways that we hadn't anticipated then through how we're getting integrated as techno-human, the techno-human condition. But his point, I think, is important. But the last thing I want to throw to you, which is something I think about a lot after 40 years of journalism, is and you have, your 20 plus quarter century of work on this, is what he says here: politicians are mostly pulling on disconnected levers, which is sobering. And it's not just politicians. That means all of us are pulling on levers that may not actually be attached to the things we are looking for, which is new energy systems. And I've been talking to folks at EASA over in Europe for years about decarbonization trends. And Holger Ragnar, this graph, I'm trying to get him to update it. This is the carbon intensity of primary energy since the year 1800. And it kind of like just goes and goes and goes. And you don't really see a lot of policy levers there. So, and here's a little, I showed this slide sometimes about humility. Are we all just yammering around something that's playing out in ways that are beyond our, some kind of knob-like control?
Yeah, I mean, I made a similar point on a panel with my good friend Jane Flagel recently, and she was like objected and said, well, that's just nihilism. And I don't think it is, because I think that recognizing that this sort of climate emissions knob is actually it's not as big or as powerful a knob as we think it is, and it's really, really hard to turn. And I think that doesn't mean that policy doesn't matter, actually.
Right.
But it does mean that, like, the way that, like we did this, like, really, kind of one of the first histories of the shale gas revolution. And the fact that,
I remember it well.
Like it really was the result of decades of federal policy. Not all of it kind of necessarily well conceived. You look at sort of the various iterations of like natural gas regulation in the 70s and 80s and things like that. And the thing is that, like, no one could like really predict the impact it would have. And it did not kind of work out the way that a lot of people thought it would. And, the shale revolution and the shale research, like, it was this weird little like backwater in the federal unconventional fuels programs. Everyone was like arguing about oil shales, which is different than shale gas, and really never worked, and syn fuels programs and things like that. And meanwhile, there was just this little tiny like budget for what would become fracking, that actually like has a huge impact. And certainly, despite I think the claims of a lot of the gas like the environmental movement liked gas until it became abundant and cheap, and then suddenly it was no longer a bridge fuel. It's certainly, if you look at these decarbonization trends you're showing there over the last couple of decades, cheap, abundant gas has been a big part of that story, and is probably going to continue to be a big part of that story for a long time. And again, I can point you back to a whole set of policy things that account for that. Like, as much as I'm like, I don't think we're going to do it all, or nearly as much as a lot of people think with variable renewable energy, like really cheap solar, and progress that has been made on wind and things like that, over time is going to kind of show up in this, but it's not going to show up on the time frame or with the sort of direct and obvious impact that I think a lot of people think it will. So, I do think that policy matters. I do think that we can have an impact, but it's just like, boy, this is a long, long, long road. It's going to unfold over a long time. And it's going to be very different, so I totally share, and I think particularly my older self, as opposed to the guy who will do like $300 billion over 10 years in an Apollo project and solve climate change. My older self is frankly has a lot more humility about a lot of this than I did. And again, like whatever youth is wasted on the young, and all those cliches. Like I don't begrudge my younger self his ambition, but I think also kind of with the benefit of hindsight and just having been someone who spent, when I first read Smeal was like, this can't be right. And I have 20 different arguments about why he's wrong. Now it kind of like, I find it increasingly difficult to argue with a lot of what Vaclav has been saying for a very long time.
Yes, for sure. Same here, especially on the rate of change. Kip Hansen, who's been an interesting and provocative figure over the years, just asked Mr. Revkin summarize your change in climate views over the last 5 years. 5 years. I would say that I as I've grown older and spent half my life on this beat. Literally, I'm 67, turning 68, and I started when I was in my early 30s. I went through a series of changes in how I perceived the climate problem. And I do a whole lecture on that. But it starts with it being a pollution problem, then being a technology problem, then being a politics problem, and then being a behavioral problem. When I talk to people like Dan Kahane about our inbuilt cultural cognition, and then that leads me to the reality that it's every problem. It's a morass of, it's a prismatic, multidimensional thing, which makes it hard to write a simple story about it. And I think that's one reason the media can't figure out how to do it. Earth was my attempt through 2,810 posts to have a more of a prismatic approach to conveying the problem and engaging with people like Kip through a dialogue with communities. And that sounds like nihilism too, right? But it's not, because it means there's something for everyone to do, whether you're a teacher, an artist, a technologist, an entrepreneur, whether you're Ted Nordhaus or Andy Revkin or my sons or whoever, you can play a part in this journey. And it's everyone else is adapted to. I just got to show Al Gore in his book that was a bestseller said adaptation is kind of laziness and arrogant faith in our ability to react in time to save our skins. But in 2013, in a book that no one read, it sold probably decently, but it got put on shelves. He said, I was wrong. Not wrong that deniers would propose adaptation as an alternative to mitigation, but wrong in not immediately grasping the moral imperative of pursuing both policies simultaneously, in spite of the difficulty that poses. But no one read that, just like I mentioned about Michael Mann's book. So the more we can do to surface the complexity and embrace it, and also be honest about learning curves, the better off I think we'll all be as we take this long journey toward a more thriving relationship with the climate system we have and the one that we're creating through climate change going forward. And that's, I think, where we will call it a day. Ted, it's been great to catch up with you, and let's do it again. I've had Patrick Brown on here and Vijaya too, and I'd love to. I like to find room for agreement more than debate. The debates get us back into the yes/no mode and the win-lose mode, which is exactly what the media are doing now with the election. It's the worst possible way to cover things. So hopefully we can have another way forward to have a sort of a room for agreement with you and maybe some people who've been critical of you guys as we're entering your 20th year.
Yeah.
To get some clarity on what works, what doesn't work. We have a really good audience. So if there's any last thing you want to say before we sign off, you have a couple of minutes, that would be great.
Anything I want to say, or
anything you want to say?
Yeah. I mean, I really appreciate it, and I appreciate, I think one of the things is that when you get into conversation as opposed to like this craziness that everyone does on like Twitter. I still can't quite bring myself to call it X, but
neither can I.
you know, you actually find a lot. Everyone seems a lot more reasonable, kind of in person, and so I definitely kind of like can commend your kind of effort to do that, and you know, I hope we'll find some opportunities to do more of it.
I think it's a sure bet. So thanks again. And for anyone watching, this gets archived right away, whatever you're watching on LinkedIn, Twitter, X, YouTube, Facebook, and we can continue this conversation going forward in some other sessions. Look at the scrolling bar at the bottom for how to get in touch with me. And thebreakthrough.org is the way to get a hold of Ted Nordhaus. Thank you for spending time. And I hope everyone reads your essay. If people go back, you'll see the links to the essay. And
it's a long read, but I hope people who kind of work their way through it will agree that it's worth it.
Well, I certainly think it was. All right. Have a good day, everyone.
Thanks so much, Andy.
And stay in touch.
Great to see you.